I paused the recording. So here, let me start again. Welcome, everyone. On behalf of SNAG, I'm so pleased to welcome Adriane Dalton, editor of Metalsmith magazine and Metalsmith Tech, offering us this amazing writing workshop today, writing about objects. And I know our time is short, so I want to get started right away. It's 1 o'clock. So Adriane, I'd like to turn it over to you.
Yeah, sure. Hi, everyone. I will also say, since Pat didn't introduce herself, Pat, Medea, she's the head. What is your title at Pratt? I don't know.
I should, and because I'm a SNAG admin now, right? So I'm Patricia Medea. Forgive me, everyone. I am the jewelry program coordinator at Pratt Institute, and I am just coming up on 1 year as a board member of SNAG. So I've been sort of taking over the webinars, the craft labs, the in conversations, and so still learning. But thank you, Adriane.
You're welcome. Okay, so thank you, Pat, for introducing me and for introducing yourself. I'm excited to be here this Saturday afternoon. Just so everyone who's on here knows, I can't see any of you or hear any of you, but you can hear and see me, hopefully. I have my laptop, I have notes in front of me, I have seltzer, I have water, and I have some slides prepared for the first portion of today's it's not a lecture, it's live Q&A. So if I'm never looking at the camera again for the rest of this talk, that's why. I have a lot of other places to look. So don't focus on me, focus on the slides. So with that said, I am going to go ahead and share my screen. And I guess, so before I get started, if folks have questions, should they put them in the chat or they raise their hand? I don't know what the...
Yeah, we can do it either way. So Adriane, so you know, I can allow people to talk if you'd like to interact verbally. If not, we can put the questions can go in the Q&A. If everyone clicks on the bottom, there's a chat and a Q&A. Those are two different things. The chat everyone can see. The Q&A will I think just come to me and you, Adriane, okay. And I'll monitor both. So feel free, if you're more comfortable with the chat, that's fine. I'll be checking it, and then we also have the Q&A option.
Yeah. Okay. Maybe when we do, well, we'll get to it when we get there, because I have something that I want to do with everyone first before we really get into the Q&A portion of today's event. So. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen, which, let's try this. And it's always a little bit of a fun transition between being in the meeting and sharing my screen. So how's that look? Can we see that? Everything's good?
Looks great.
Okay, great, wonderful. Okay, so just to introduce myself further, though Pat did a great job, I'm Adriane Dalton. I'm the editor for Metalsmith and Metalsmith Tech, and as you can see here, there's some recent issues that have come out. So I'm sure many of you are SNAG members or perhaps subscribers, but for those of you who aren't, I hope you will consider checking us out if this is your first introduction to SNAG and your first introduction to the magazine. Happy to answer more questions about that during the Q&A section. So just to give you some background about me, I have a background in jewelry and metalsmithing. I have a BFA from the University of the Arts in Philadelphia, which is sort of where I was introduced to art jewelry. And I studied there under Sharon Church and Lola Brooks, and then I took a big break between undergrad and deciding to go to graduate school, which I attended Parsons. The New School for Design has a master's in history of decorative arts and design, though I think that the title of it has changed now since I graduated. So that's where I received my MA, and my focus in graduate school was on popular culture, advertising culture, but also history of American craft, American studio craft in particular, and particularly jewelry, because that is just sort of what I have always gravitated towards. So I spent some time as the assistant curator for the Nora Eccles Harrison Museum of Art in Logan, Utah at Utah State University, which is actually where I was first introduced to the exercise that I'm going to go through with you today as an educator there. I'll share a little bit more about that in a minute. But for those of you, I know we have folks on here from probably all over the country and all over the world. So if you ever find yourself in Utah, or you are in Utah and you are in the northern part of the state, I highly recommend the museum there. It's a really hidden gem of the state. It has a really incredible ceramics, significant ceramics, American ceramics collection it's just not well known just because of its geographic isolation, basically. But anyways, that's not what I'm here to talk about. So before we get into the Q&A portion, I want to walk us through an exercise that is something that I use as a teaching tool, and it's something that I also use for myself as a writing prompt if I'm feeling a little bit stuck or if I just need to loosen up. And I know that in the reminder emails that were sent, I sent one, and I know some came from Pat about today's meeting. I asked everyone to have something to write on and with. Now, for some of you, that might be your computers, but the key aspect is that you need to be able to continue to view the meeting window in whatever form you choose. So if you are typing on your laptop, just know that you're going to need to keep the slide in view, because that will be a key portion of it. So, let me go to my next slide. Okay, so what we're going to do today is an adaptation of a visual thinking exercise called See, Think, Wonder. And it was developed as part of the Visual Thinking Project by Project Zero at the Harvard School of Education. And I was sort of initiated into this practice by the curator of education at the museum in Utah where I worked. And I used it in the galleries. I used it working with museum tour groups as young as 5 and all the way up to masters in business administration. So, you know, it's a really good practice that sort of transcends not just art. It can be applied in a lot of different areas, but we're going to apply it to objects today. So first, what we're going to do is, so I've adapted this a little bit and I'll explain the adaptation as we go through it. I have some examples. I'm going to walk us through the process using an example image, and then we're going to have some time to go through the process on our own individually, and then we will sort of have a discussion, and maybe then we will turn on microphones if that's a possibility, and we can kind of see how that works when we get to that. And so then after we go through that, we will then have the Q&A portion. So let me go to my next slide. Okay, so the way that I've adapted this exercise is the first step is still about seeing. The thing about, so for this object, I'll talk about what this object is and who made it after we go through the next couple of steps, but this object might be familiar to many of you. It's certainly familiar to me, and the reason I chose this particular object for the illustration of how to do this exercise is because familiarity can actually sometimes really be a burden when you're trying to write about your own work or someone else's work. Sometimes familiarity can prevent you from communicating effectively to an audience that's sort of uninitiated or doesn't share the same specialized knowledge that you might have. For example, if you have specialized knowledge, you might know the specific process by which a piece was made, either because you made it yourself or because you have material knowledge or training. And you also may know the social and historical context for an object. And sometimes that knowledge can get in the way of actually seeing the piece. So if you have the specialized knowledge and you are starting from that place, sometimes you might be making assumptions about what kind of knowledge base your audience shares with you. And you might be creating more questions for them than you're providing answers to. And this also, sort of my approach to this as a writer also comes from my background as a curator, because when you are in a museum, You have to write interpretive texts that make sure, and you're sort of always succeeding and failing in varying degrees, that you can sort of translate a dense amount of information into a small text for your visitors. So the idea of this will the idea of starting with seeing will help you kind of get out of your own knowledge a bit. And familiarity also with when you're writing about your own work can sometimes be an impediment because you can't disconnect enough from the piece in order to, like, let's say, write a brief description for like an item in the shop on your website can be an issue sometimes. Sometimes it could be when you're writing an artist statement or something for an application for a call for entry. There are lots of uses for that. So for the first step, I have some of the prompts here that will help you. I'll leave, these will be in the slides later when we run through the exercise, so you'll be able to reference them. But basically, the first step is to just describe the object based just on your visual observations. So for me, that means disconnecting from any assumptions or knowledge that you have about what the form and the material are. So the knowledge that I have of this piece is that it's made from gold and silver. That's something that I know, but I need to disconnect from that in order to think about what I'm seeing. So there's also, of course, like a visual trickery going on in this piece that we'll talk about a little bit more later. But so when I look at this, the parts that are meant to resemble staples, to me, just become white lines. They're short white dashes. And that's a way of distilling what that really is with what it looks like. The overall shape of the object is an imperfect octagon. It could be a series of geometric flat planes. It could be a series of planes connected with light and dark stripes or striations. The edge of the plane could be black triangles or V shapes or an undulating line that goes through a strip of black. It can be just as simple as you can get it. If it has dots on it, say it has small circles on it. If it's a bezel could be a chain. It could be, not a chain, a bezel could be a circle. It could be an oval. It could be a rectangle or a square. It could be any number of shapes. And one of the examples that I put in here is that if you're looking at a chain, a chain might be a series of interlocking circles. And that's a way to sort of distill down the visual information to simplify it. Color is another thing that you can sort of really hone in on. And this, of course, has many different shades of what seem like tan or gold or brown. And it can be, you can really get in depth if you are someone who's kind of like a color nerd, which I'm not necessarily, one of those people who can, name all the Pantone colors or anything like that. But some people are, and maybe if that is your, if something that entices you, follow what you're inclined towards, follow what you're drawn towards. So once you've sort of exhausted that aspect of the piece, a step that I've added that I find useful is before, rather than see, think, wonder, I've added feel. Because before we start to let our rational thinking mind tell us what the piece is and what it's about, I think it's important to stop and try and disconnect from that and just think about, but just write down what the words are that come up for you that might be associated with the piece. So for me, when I look at this piece, some of the words that come to mind for me are amusement, reverence, deception. And when you get to this step, when we go through this exercise, don't feel like you need to write explanations for the feelings or emotions. They could just be single words. You don't need to connect them to the piece directly. You just need to write them down. So after you've gone through that, I've combined the final steps of think and wonder because they're so closely associated for me. This is the step in the process in which you've broken down the piece visually. You've decided or made some choices about how it feels to you or how it makes you feel. And now you have an opportunity to bring your knowledge or any knowledge you may have back into the way that you're looking at the piece. So now you could say, okay, I'm going to use my knowledge to describe this piece as I understand it. And in doing that, you know, you may come up with some questions because there may be gaps in your understanding or your knowledge of the piece. For example, I know that this piece is made from gold and silver. I know that it's not made from cardboard, but it does look strikingly like a piece of cardboard. Now, I know this information because I am familiar with the work, but I have no idea how this piece is constructed, even though I have, I mean, I guess I have a little bit of an idea, but you know, this piece is a conundrum to me, and I think that it asks a lot of questions, like what is the process by which the material can be made to look so much like this cheap paper material when it is made from something that is hard and solid and precious. If you have information about the artist at this time, you might add that in. You might ask questions like, who is this artist? What is their background? What is their other work like? How does this piece connect to their larger collection of works? Where does this piece fit into sort of a fuller picture of not just the artist and their work, but the field as a whole, or where is it situated socially or culturally? And those are kind of things that come up in this final part of the process. Now, because of time, we're not going to spend a ton of time doing this because it'll just be us really sitting in silence, but I do want to give you the information for this piece for anyone who doesn't know what it is before we move on. So this is a bracelet by, I believe, Swiss artist, David Bielander. And I know on my laptop, this image looks good, but on my external monitor, it's huge and doesn't look quite as good. So if it looks kind of blurry for you, I apologize. I promise the next image that we are going to use when we go through this process will look a little bit better. Pardon me one moment. So before we give some time to go through this process individually, I just want to stop and see if anyone has any questions, because I know I talk very quickly.
So anyone, if you'd like to type your question into the chat or the Q&A section, or just if you can do a hand raise, I'm happy to unmute you so you could ask your question. Okay. I'm not, so Adrienne, I'm not seeing anyone posing any questions at this point.
All right, so then here's what we are going to do. Either—
Sorry, questions coming in.
Okay, good. All right.
When do you, so this is actually Susan Cummins. Hi, Susan.
Hi, Susan.
When do you get to the place where you are understanding the meaning?
I think understanding the meaning comes from research. So after you go through this exercise, then you have to do research. Then you have to look and see, like, what does this artist say about their work? What do other people say about their work? You know, so the final step, and thank you, Susan, this is a good question, and I don't think I made it very clear. Yeah, the wonder portion drives what you do next with the writing. If you're writing about your own work, then you are in the precarious situation of having to answer these questions that you've asked, and sometimes that opens a whole other can of worms. But if you're writing about an artist's work, there should be, hopefully, research options, whether that is the artist's website, reaching out to the artist directly. If it's an artist who's not living, perhaps looking into archival information. There are a lot of different avenues for that could be pursued depending on the context of the work and the context of the writing that you're planning to do.
And we have another, thank you, Adrienne. And we have another question from Kim Ward. Is there a sample description written for this particular piece?
For this bracelet?
The David Bielander piece?
I do not have one. No, I haven't crafted a description. I just used it as an example for the exercise. So.
And then we also have a question from Virginia, and she's asking, typically, where would you use these writing skills? For articles, etc.?
So this particular exercise is really more focused on individual objects that you might be thinking about. So they can be applied a lot of different ways. It really depends on what the context is. If you're writing about your own work, it can help you to disconnect from the piece a little bit so that you can craft an artist statement, that you can write descriptive texts either for sales purposes or for calls for entry. Perhaps if someone has asked you to write about your work for something or give a public lecture about your work, it might help you in those terms. If you're writing about someone else's work, it can be useful if you're thinking about descriptive writing. But I mean, it depends. There's like really an infinite amount of ways in which you could sort of craft something like this into a bigger project.
And someone also mentioned social media posts.
Yes, yeah, yes, perfect for social media posts, and you know, any kind of like sort of promotional or public facing, I suppose, practices. Now, I will say for me, aside from my role as editor, I'm also a maker, and so I use writing as a tool in my creative practice as well, because it actually gives me a way to sort of think through some of my ideas materially that I don't always have an opportunity to do. It sort of helps me clear up my thinking about sometimes the conceptual nature of what I'm doing, and also that can be useful, I think, for some people. Now, I know for some people writing feels you know, like being a cat on roller skates, and it just feels really awkward and like you're doing something that you aren't meant to do. But I think, like any material-based practice, any art practice, writing is just that. It is a craft, it is a practice, and you have to work at it. You have to spend the time doing it in order to build sort of the muscle memory of your craft, just like you would if you're sitting at your jeweler's bench. You know, the first time you sat down to, you know, to create your first jewelry project, it probably, you know, you probably struggled and you probably broke some saw blades, or, you know, maybe you dropped your file 1,000 times, you know, and as time goes on, you learn how to use your tools, and it becomes sort of a second nature to you. I'll take one more question and then we'll do the exercise.
I think we've answered them all, Adriane.
Great. All right, wonderful. And of course, we're going to have more time to do that at the end. So I'll just go ahead and say the next set of slides will have an image. In fact, hold on. Okay, I had turned your cameras off on here because I thought I would be able to see you all. I didn't know I wouldn't be able to. So the prompts that have been featured in text on the last few slides will still be on the next slide, so that you have them for reference as you're going through this. We'll have about 2 minutes per slide. I know that that's not a lot of time, but I also don't want to keep us sitting here silent for too long, because that seems awkward to me. But I'll keep the time. I'll change the slides as we go through, and then when we get to the end, we'll sort of return, and you'll have an opportunity to share some of your insights as we go through. But you know, I can't see what you're doing, so you could just sit here for 6 minutes. I won't know. So it's up to you. All right, so with that, I am going to also turn, well, I guess I can't. Okay, I'll just sit quietly and I will let us go ahead and get started. Okay, we are going to go ahead and go to the next slide. Okay, we are going to now go to the last slide. right, so let's go ahead and wrap up. And I will go ahead and share the information about this piece with everyone so that you can see a little bit about what it is made of and who made it. So this is a piece by Daryl Jumbo, who is a Diné artist who is based, I think, in Arizona, but is from New Mexico. And I actually don't know a ton about this artist, but I found this piece when I was looking through the collection of the Museum of Arts and Design in New York to try and find some ideas for pieces to show you during this presentation that might be good for illustrating the point, though. You know, you could really do this with any kind of object. I, in the museum setting, would sometimes be running this exercise with very abstract paintings, and that can actually be, in a lot of ways, much harder than having something that has a lot of elements to it, as this piece has. So with that said, I would like to go back a few slides to our first slide from this object and ask everyone to maybe share some of their not thoughts, I guess, but their observations of the piece.
So please feel free to, if you want to do a hand raise, I should be able to see it. If not, you can just type into the chat that you'd like to speak, and I'm happy to allow you to talk.
Yeah, that would be great. I would like to hear some other voices.
Allison, go ahead. Oops. Allison, can you unmute? You should be able to unmute.
Sorry about that. Okay, can you hear me?
Yes,
okay, great.
Hi, Allison. How are you?
Hi there. Okay, so when I look at it, I see it's some sort of figure, eyes, hands, nose, texture, lines, dots, protrusions, or it's just the first word that came to mind.
Yeah,
yeah.
All right, we have someone else. Teresa.
Hello, can you hear me?
Hi, Teresa. Yes,
hi, Teresa.
So I had organic rounded reaching shapes covered in a fine texture and deep center lines reminiscent of leaves blowing as if by the wind, monochromatic metallic gray except for two shiny glass-like circles reminiscent of the large eyes of a curious owl.
Great, yeah.
Oops, I have somebody else. Madeline, okay. You just need to unmute, Madeline.
Okay, I have 3 layers of a gray pebbly surface with darker dots and lines covering 3 colorful round orbs, 2 large multicolor ones and 1 smaller red one with 2 protrusions of the pebbly gray surface above the upper 2 orbs.
That's great. I like how you sort of referred to some, like, this is a very difficult exercise. It is really hard to come up with sometimes the descriptive words. I like pebbly as a descriptive of the texture. I think that's interesting.
I'm unmuting Mandy. Mandy, do you want to just unmute and?
Yeah, I have stylized feather-like wings, red nose peeking out with its soft eyes give this horned creature a cute rather than malevolent appearance.
Okay. That's great. So I think, is it Mary? Mary, do you want to jump in there?
Sure. When I was trying to describe this, it actually brought me to a question, because when I was trying to describe it, I kept analogizing what I saw. Like I wrote, the metal also forms 2 horns, curved triangles on top of the circular forms, or the pattern silver flows in leafy forms. So I kept being comparative, and I wasn't sure what the role of being comparative was. I felt like I was better able to describe it by saying it's like feathers, it's like leaves. But that's a little different to what you said before, which is like just circle, or, you know, leave your technical knowledge aside.
I'm glad that you mentioned this, Mary. Thank you. So that's the real challenge with this first aspect of this. And, you know, if we were all together in a room and we were looking at this object together and having a conversation about it, it would be a little bit different, I think, than all of us sort of being in our own places. But it is difficult to disconnect from from interpreting forms and try and just we really have to kind of force ourselves to do it, to say, okay, in my mind, I know that these are probably a stylized version of feathers, but how do I focus on just what I'm seeing and not what I know? So for some of the things that I wrote oblong drops, because those feather forms to me have sort of like a drop-like shape. I wrote curved, someone else, I don't know if it was you or the person before you, said curved triangles as the horns. I also wrote that. But, you know, saying horns and saying curved triangles mean different things. One, we have associations with. The word horns obviously conjures an animal of some kind, whereas curved triangles is, I don't know that it's neutral necessarily, but it doesn't have the same associations or connections. And that's not to say that one is right and one is wrong. It's just a practice of trying to force ourselves to look at things differently. Yeah, I don't know if that was helpful.
I also, Jane typed into the chat, shy, feathers, wings, pop of color, texture, hiding.
Mm-hmm. So that incorporates some of the next slide, which actually, let's go ahead and move on to this. So let's talk a little bit about, because this came up a little bit in Jane's description of feeling, like what does this piece feel like, or how does it make us feel?
All right, so let me, that was Mary. I just unmuted Mary. Did you wanna?
I actually clicked on the button by mistake, sorry.
No worries, no worries at all. I think Allison? Allison, if you could,
Hello, yes.
oh, there you go, yay.
It's the window didn't pop up before. It's a feeling of movement to me.
Okay. Oh, wait, we have a bunch of hands here. Heba. Hi, Heba.
Hi, how are you?
Good, nice to see you again.
Thanks. Yeah, and you too. Thanks for doing this, by the way. It's really very informative. I get the feeling of hiding from this piece, like mystery and hiding. And one question I had typed, if I may ask it now, what would be a good example? Like, are you going to provide something that, because everything was like, it's, you know, there's nothing, you know, bad or good, but what would be a great example, I guess?
I'm really reluctant to give a great example because I don't think that, like, I think it's open to interpretation. Do you mean like do you want to know what I wrote for some of these things? Because is that kind of what you're asking? Like what I thought?
What would, like if you were a curator and you're curating this object and you're gonna present it, what would be a really good description?
Well, I mean, that would take time and research for me to write, which I haven't. Okay. I didn't prepare for this, but if I can say that if I were running this exercise in a gallery setting and we were having this conversation there, you know, I would prompt, and maybe if we were sort of in a more conversational setting, I would like prompt or push different responses in different ways. I think, you know, going back to like the seeing, really trying to push the disconnect from making a sort of like a knowledge-based assessment of the object. So like if we say it looks like an owl, that's us assigning something to it. And instead of saying, even though yes, it does look like an owl, let's break that down. Let's break this down to its basics. Like let's break it down into shapes. Let's break it down into circles and curved triangles and lines and dots, and just try and break that down a bit more. Does that help a little bit?
Yeah, I'm just trying to see how the system, which I think is very extremely useful, would be really applied in real life. Like maybe going backwards, like taking a description that somebody wrote and then point out the points of the exercise. Like here is where they've introduced the emotions. Here is where they've used description that's not does not have connotation, or you know what I'm saying, just to see how the system actually ends up in real life.
Right. Well, I mean, I don't know. That would be very difficult, I think, to do, though not impossible, because I do think it depends on, like, this is really meant to be a writing prompt, not necessarily with a specific outcome in mind. It's meant to sort of be an exercise to help you loosen up and think about how you're writing. But you could apply this and use it in a lot of different directions. So that, I think, while not impossible, I understand what you're saying. I've made a note about it to see if I can try and find something that would work for that, for maybe a future version of these.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Thanks, Heba. I'm going to actually let, is it Tracy? Tracy?
Hello?
Hey.
Hi. Well, my thoughts were it's cute and evil, and my feelings were curious, uneasy, amused, and disturbed.
Okay.
And that's all I wrote. I just jotted. And then I wrote a bunch of other stuff, but I think that goes more into the descriptive toward the end. I kept like writing a lot more assumptions about it rather than going back to like the core nitty gritty. But anyway.
No, I think that that's great. And I think that something that I think has come up in a lot of the responses that you all have shared so far is that there's overlap. There's overlap between seeing and feeling. There's overlap between, feeling and thinking. It's sort of, I don't want to like make it be too rigid. Like I think if you're doing this on your own by yourself, it might make sense for you to sort of do the observational portion of this and then combine the feeling, thinking, and wondering all into one step. It's not regimented, it's an exercise. And you can adjust it to, work for your own purposes, whatever, your process is. Maybe you hate trying to disconnect from your knowledge. And a lot of us do. I think we work very hard to gain the knowledge that we have. And so for us to say, okay, I'm trying to push some of this vocabulary I have aside, that can be challenging, not just because it's hard to do, but because we've worked very hard to build that vocabulary.
I see, Madeline, are you raising your hand again? I think you should be able to just unmute.
Okay. Yes, it asked what the feeling was, and my feeling when I looked at that was actually distaste, just because I don't find the forms and colors appealing, and there's no easily discernible shape, even though I can guess that it's meant to be an owl. It somehow doesn't capture the fluffiness or the grace of an owl. And when I look at it, it just doesn't look like enough of anything. It's slightly disturbing.
Okay. And that's something that you bring up, a really interesting point that is something that I think about a lot is that, we shouldn't always be writing about things we like. We should be investigating and thinking about what our responses are to something. And if our response might be distaste or disturbance or disgust, I think those are just as valid places to think or write from, not necessarily as an evaluation of the value of an object, but just sort of, those can be a method for how you think about, like, what is this? Why is this the way that it is? And I think that response, the repulsion response, can be very motivating when you're doing research.
And Adriane, Jane makes a great point, which I think you have also alluded to a number of times, is that the audience is really critical in writing and how you write, whether it's going to be something for a social media post or for something academic or some, that those are very different kinds of writing.
Absolutely. Yes, that is absolutely right. Thank you, Jane. So I think it's probably a good time for us to move to the final aspect of this and talk about this a little bit more, and then we can just sort of open it up for more specific or more general questions depending on that. So yeah, perhaps there's someone on this call who knows this artist's work. Maybe they know something about this piece. Maybe they have some knowledge about it or the process. Does anyone have any thoughts or questions that came up for them?
So I see, is it Alpa? I'm gonna Alpa, would you like to jump in there?
Oh, I had a question from the previous slide, and
okay.
I wanted to ask is, as a maker and an artist, so much of the process is intuitive. So you might have a concept, an idea of making something, and as you make, you just kind of let intuition take over. How do you write about that? Which is always a struggle for me. How do you put those feelings after the object is made? Like, I sometimes find it difficult to put those in words. Is there an exercise that you do to help with that?
This, I think, so depending on your practice, I think that is probably a shared struggle for many makers, is that you get into those flow moments and you're working, you're not in an analytical mind while you are doing every part of your process, depending on how you work and sort of where you are in the process. So I think if you are someone who works intuitively, I think that then you may need to sit with your object or sit with what is happening in your mind while you're working intuitively, and not in the moment of working, but after the fact in a reflective manner. A lot of, just speaking personally for my own making practice, a lot of what I do in my practice, it has a research and conceptual basis to it that is informed by different things, texts, research. But when I'm in the making of it, I am just sort of, I'm making decisions as I'm making. I'm not making all the parts, laying them out, and then putting them together. I'm letting the material inform my process. But I think in order to know that that's how I work, I've had to sit and think about how that is how I work. And so I know this isn't probably very useful to you to hear, but I think you just have to be, you just kind of have to interrogate your intentions.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Heba, did you have your hand up again? I think you can just unmute if you'd like to say something.
No, I didn't.
Oh, okay.
I have to lower my hand, sorry.
Oh, okay. I wasn't sure. I actually wasn't quite sure how that was working, so I wanted to make sure. Thank you.
Sure.
So did anyone else have thoughts or questions that came up for this piece?
Allison, is that your hand up?
Yes. Where's the unmute?
We can hear
you're
you.
good. We hear you. You're unmuted.
Oh, you do? Okay.
Yeah.
So So when thinking about this, I started to think, wait, I need to look up owls and what are their feathers like? And I mean, do owls actually have a nose? And so I just started, thinking more in detail about an owl itself, even though obviously this is not supposed to be a replication of an owl. So just some of the thoughts going through my mind.
Yeah, but those I think all point to things that you could look up that might answer some of these questions. I mean, obviously this is a stylized representation of something that may or may not be an owl. There are things that indicate to us that it very well could be an owl. The eyes, the horns, the wings, I think, are what is sort of the more stylized portion of it. But what about, did anyone have any, when you got to this place, for those of you who may have a making practice or have a sort of knowledge base that tells you how this was made, did any of you bring that in when you were looking at this portion, or when we got to this portion of the exercise?
Mm-hmm.
To that comment, Adrienne, I see that Jane was saying bezel set stones, pierced, etched, stylized, feathers, wings, mid-century inspired. I thought was rather interesting. Teresa, sure. I think you should be able to just unmute.
Yeah, so I was curious whether, I don't know stones very well, but I'm an enamelist, so I was curious whether the eyes are enamel, vitreous enamel, or stone cabochons. That was what I was most curious about.
Which actually, let's go to the next slide, which will still allow us to talk about the piece, but we'll have some of the information. So according to the information on the collections website, it's sea snail opercula, which I actually don't know what that is, and I didn't look it up before we had this because I wanted to see if anybody else knew what it was, or if we could talk about sort of material research, things like that. So I intentionally didn't look it up.
Let's see if anyone's raising their hand. I actually do not know what that is.
I have a guess, and maybe Allison. I see.
Oh, Allison, go ahead. Yeah. Go ahead, Allison.
I mean, my guess is when it says sea snail, it's some sort of fossilized shell.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes, and I'm going to say from looking at this, it looks very much like a taxidermy eye to me. You know how like a taxidermy animal eye is like, it's really just printed on paper and it's glass over top of it, unless they're like the nice ones that are probably like flame worked glass eyes, which I bet are a specialized, super specialized market. But I think it may be that there may be some kind of lens over it, or maybe the shell has glass over top of it or something. That is sort of what I assumed by the word opercula. I assumed that refers to a lens of some kind. Did Allison put her hand back up, or Allison, can you?
Oh, oops.
So if I may, I was really interested in the scale of this piece, and then when I see that it's 2.75 by 3 inches, I'm like, that's small. I expected it to be larger than that.
Yeah, well, right now I have it on a giant screen next to me, and it's like 8 inches by 5 inches. So,
Teresa.
Yeah, that just the issue of scale is something that I struggle with a lot in my work because I create enameled miniatures, and it's, you know, I have gross hands and I never want to shoot, you know, things in my hands. So trying to describe these things so that people understand how tiny they are. Do you have any thoughts on that or help for us with that kind of descriptive copy?
Well, it's always good to put the dimensions in, either in inches or centimeters, because I think that is a universal way that people at least can if they aren't someone who is great at sort of like making those spatial connections when they see a measurement, they can at least pick up a ruler or, you know, some form of measuring and see what the dimensions are. With tiny objects, it can be really difficult because, you know, as you know, if you have looked at an issue of Metalsmith, the size that an image is printed or presented is not to scale with the piece. It's just not possible to do it that way because you either lose detail or it wouldn't fit on the page, or it would be so small that you would never be able to know what it is. I mean, my suggestion is always just to have very detailed dimensions if possible. And when you're writing your description, you know, write your materials in there. This exercise could be useful for writing a process-based description as a maker. You could, you know, when you get to this final step, you could apply, you know, all of these things. Like, let's say if you are an enamelist and you're working in a Limoges painting style, you could say, you know, painted with a handmade paintbrush using only 3 cat hairs or whatever it is that, you know, whatever specialized tool you've made yourself to do your work, or, you know, there are ways to explain what you do to someone without having to explain every aspect of what it is that you do. Because the focus really, you want to be on the piece itself. If you're trying to sell it, of course. If you're trying to show it, then it can be a little bit different. Of course, it's always nice when a piece sells, but sometimes you are creating something conceptual and non-functional, and you might not care if it sells. You might just want to express your idea through your art form to the world. So that could look different.
Something that I just want to throw out there is this idea of seeing the piece, you know, obviously on the body. I know that's not part of what this exercise is about, but that's definitely a way to convey that. And I just wanted to kind of maybe bring up the exhibition that was created by Patty Bleischer at Gallery Loop. I think it was 40 artists respond to, it was early on in the COVID experience, and how she had created this online catalog that every artist showed that piece, you know, on the body. And that was so incredibly helpful when viewing those pieces.
Yeah, I think having the body, if it's work that's made for the body, I think it's always helpful to have the body for scale, even if you're making something tiny. If it's pinned or if it's on an ear or whatever it is, you know, it translates to the viewer in a different way than, you know, something that's on a flat white background would do. Yeah.
And I think Heba had her hand up. Heba?
Yes, so that's a very interesting point I want to ask about. Is when I entered this field, their message has always been, don't put anything around your objects, you know, take pictures with like white background or black background, don't put anything. And I agree. I think every object for me, if I'm going to purchase it or if I'm the audience, I appreciate it more on a person. So why is it this trend about don't put it on person, don't put it on anything? You know what
Well, I think it depends on the venue for where the piece is being shown as an image. So I think this, not to open a can of worms here towards the end, I want to make sure everybody has time to ask questions. But there's a couple things. One of them is that the way that we exist in the world is that we send our objects out into virtual space for other people to consume them as purely images in a lot of circumstances, particularly at this current moment where many of us in many parts of the world are being affected by shelter in place and things like this. So in one sense, having a white background or a plain background is cleaner. It's cleaner for print purposes and design purposes, but it might not communicate the spirit of your piece. So If it's for, you know, sort of like a gallery setting, there are different, you know, sort of approaches, something like what we see here with this sterile jumbo piece, you know, white background. It does obscure the scale, but we have the measurements to sort of alleviate that. I personally think it's always worthwhile to have one image, and many calls for entry ask for an image of work on the body if it is made to be on the body. But if you look at sales sites like Etsy, for example, and other places where people of varying, you know, levels of production sell their work, some people do put them in scenes because that is part of their style, their aesthetic for their line of jewelry. And I don't think that there's necessarily anything wrong with that. It just depends on the context. And I think that in the context of the focus being just on the object itself, that's, I think, the impetus behind having sort of neutral backgrounds, because they can be distracting. For example, if a piece is on a background that if it's on a paper that has a texture, or if it's on a fabric that has a texture, those in a digital format turn into sort of what is referred to as digital noise, and it creates distortion effect that can be distracting from the piece. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much.
Yeah. So I see that we only, it's like we have just a little bit more time. So I just want to open it up to any questions. It doesn't have to be about this exercise. It could be about anything. Is that what you were going to say, Pat? I'm sorry, I cut you off.
No, I'm sorry. No, this is, please. I actually wanted to just ask you about, as an editor of a prominent magazine in our field, how does that affect like how you receive an image, or how an image is, you know, a piece is portrayed? Like, how does that affect your decisions as an editor, maybe?
Right. I'm going to stop sharing my screen just so that, you know, we can just go back to, I can see some people's faces. Well, there's a couple factors. One of the factors is that whatever image we receive has to be a high enough quality that it can be printed and not be blurry or grainy. So that is always a struggle when getting images for print articles, because sometimes you might have what your computer tells you is a high-res image, but the file size might be under, you know, 1 megabyte or whatever, and that's not a big enough, there's not enough information in that file for us to make the image big enough for people to actually see it, or for the print quality to be good. So file size is always an issue. So those of you who take your own photographs and are editing your own photographs, that's something to consider too, is that what you have, a high resolution image that may be scaled for web might not work for print. And I tell people, keep your raw files. If you shoot your own photography for your work, I'm sure many of you also use photographers, and they might send you images. You know, they're huge files, but you have them, and you can use them to, you know, if on a whim someone's like, oh, we really need to print this, but this image that you have that's edited is not, it's not big enough for us to print it and have it still look good. Because at the end of the day, that's what my, you know, aim is to just make sure that your piece is well represented.
That's great. Thank you. And someone mentioned, I think it was Alpa actually mentioned, that as a maker, I am interested in the back of a piece as well. And is this something that we could talk about, especially on things like brooches?
Yeah, I love to see the back of a piece. And, you know, sometimes the back is not remarkable, and sometimes it's really fascinating. Like, for example, this brooch that I'm wearing is a Benedict Fisher brooch, and it's a seashell. And I don't know if you can see it because I'm very far away, and I don't think I can take it off easily. But the back of it tells you how the piece is made in a way, because it's not made from metal, and there's like a sculpty sort of like polymer clay in it that's sort of giving it structure and all of these things. So I love to see the back of a piece, not just because it tells me about how the piece is constructed, but also about how well the clasp is made and whether it's going to function. And that's like for a wearing purpose, not necessarily for a visual purpose. There was an exhibition, an online exhibition. It may have been an in-person exhibition many years ago, and I cannot think of the person who coordinated it, but I believe it started on Craft House, which is now a defunct, I think, sort of Facebook for makers in a way. But I think it's still up. I just don't think it's not active anymore. And it was called Back of the Brooch, and it was exactly that. It was people who sent in images. It was a sort of a curated selection of images of the front of the piece with the back of the piece. So
there was also a book that was about brooches and also front and back.
Actually, I think that may be connected. I think those projects are the same. Yeah.
To the exhibition. So that was the publication that was from the exhibition. Yeah, that's a great book. I think to the point that brooch book also looks at brooch mechanisms on pieces, which is really great. Oh, someone's mentioning that in the chat as well. So you got that.
Wonderful. And so it looks like it's 2:10. I would say just a couple more questions and then I have to shoot. So
anyone else? If you have a question, oh wait, oh Alba, did you want to? You can. I think you can just unmute.
Yeah. So my question was, when you write the details on the object, the technical details, does it matter to who the article is going to or the description is for on how much detail you put in? Because makers want to know more about how it's made, and maybe buyers don't want to. Some buyers do, some buyers don't.
Right. Yeah, it really depends on audience, and we could do an entire other 1 hour series on like who your audience is and how to write for your audience.
There you go, Adrienne. That's our next one.
Yeah, that'll be our next one. But really, it is about you have to try and strike a balance, and I think that's where someone like me, who is an editor, comes in. Is I often ask questions like, I don't know what this term means, or can you describe this process? And then you might have to write a lot and then pare it down in order to sort of distill your technical process into a smaller space, word-wise. But I think it depends. If you're writing, let's say, for Metalsmith Tech, you can get very technical. You have the space to do it. You can be very detailed. You can lay things out. And the audience really is sort of an initiated audience, if you will, since many of the people who would be reading that publication are makers or have some kind of creative practice, but not all of them. Whereas if you're writing a description for, your website, you may not want to focus on that as much as maybe your materials, if you're working in precious materials as well, since many people who are buying jewelry are have very specific ideas about what materials they value.
So if you are writing to submit for say a juried exhibition, I'm sorry, or a competition, how much of that would you include, or how much of the more descriptive nuances that you would include?
I guess it depends on how much space you're given and what the call asks for. Since most calls don't ask for a lot of information. Some calls ask for none whatsoever. You just send in the image and you send in the materials and dimensions and the date it was made, and that's kind of it. That's a really difficult question for me to answer, because I think what you should do is decide what the most important information is to you that you think the viewer needs to know. And I know that can be tricky to do, but I think that's kind of the thing is who's looking at it and what is the most important thing that you think that they need to know.
Great, thank you.
Welcome.
And Teresa, I'm not sure, I think you had a question earlier, if you would like to maybe be our last question.
Well, I don't know if it might be another session's worth of stuff, but I was just curious how this type of writing affects your own documentation of your work. If you have any comments on that.
You mean descriptive writing?
Yes.
I use descriptive writing for my own work to help me think about how my piece is made and what sort of, and I connect that to sort of some of the conceptual aspects of my work. So because they're very related for my practice. But I think it can also be useful if you've written lengthy descriptions of your work that might just be for you when you're writing them, that then you have something to start from when someone else wants to know about your work.
Okay.
You don't have to give them everything that you've written, but you have something to pull from and just say, okay, you know, I said that I'm influenced by the landscape of the Southwest, or I am influenced by sort of postmodernism, or, you know, all of these different things. Like, you have something to pull from if you've spent some time kind of starting with what I would just call just like verbal vomit is sort of what I refer to as. Just start, don't think about structure, don't think about, you know, who's going to see it. If you're just writing about your own work and you're just writing it for yourself, just start writing and see what comes out. Don't worry about grammar and sentence structure, just put words on a page. And then you can go back, and then you can shape, and then you can build, and then you can edit.
Okay, thank you.
Adrienne, I don't know if you want to do one more. It's up to you. Someone asked about captions.
Captions. I would love to answer a question about captions if someone wants to ask me more specifically what the question is.
It was just, can you briefly discuss captions?
Well, I guess it depends on the caption. Like, the caption for the Daryl Jumbo piece was very minimal. So was the David Belander caption. And those are captions that are from the artist or from the museum where they're from. So, I mean, it depends on if it's a descriptive caption in which you have some contextual information, social and cultural information, historical information, things like that. Or if it's simply just, this is the artist, this is the name of the piece, this is the year, these are the materials, these are the dimensions, this is the photographer. That's usually the basics. So I know that's not like a great response necessarily, but
I think that's perfect. Thank you. And I just want to say that Alpha wants to thank you for your coming of age article.
Oh, you're welcome. I'm glad that you enjoyed it.
Great. So I think on that note, maybe we'll end our webinar. I'd like to, of course, thank everyone for coming. Adrienne, for this amazing wealth of knowledge and the opportunity for us to think about writing and more deeply.
Yes, thank you everyone for coming. I enjoy doing this, and I really appreciate you participating, and I value your questions. For anyone who's still here on the call, please know if you ever want to pitch an article, I take pitches on a rolling basis. You can email me at editor@snagmetalsmith.org. All my contact information is on SNAG's website, which you should know how to get to since you're here on this webinar with us today. So yes, just know I'm always open to pitches. Feel free to pitch me anytime. And maybe we can do another session on how to make a pitch one of these days. So
I'm making some notes for our next sessions. I think it would be great to definitely continue this workshop.
Yes, I would love that.
So much, it's been so valuable. So thank you. Thanks.
Thank you everyone so much.
Have a great rest of your weekend.
Yes, you too.
All right. Take care. Thanks, Adrienne.
Yes, you're welcome. Thank you, Pat, for everything.